Hello and welcome back to this channel where of course the talks are real, the talks are raw and nothing scripted, nothing jotted down, just on the top of my head saying the things that come in. And so the topic of this video is the real ego. What the real ego is and how people have falsified it, or how people do not seem to recognize what the real ego is, and what people kind of go on with this false definition of the ego. And of course ego has been like this demonized, deified thing that has came across in many people's life. People have been always been told that ego is bad, ego is not a good thing to have, and it is true, no doubt that it is of course bad, but it is the pompous ego, not the real ego, that is bad. The real ego is what we will be talking about in this video, how or about how people have kind of fluidized this concept of the real ego and the falsified ego, how they have kind of lost this distinction between walls really between what real ego is and what false ego is. So today we are going to talk about it, what the real ego is and what the falsified ego is. So first, let's take a look at the falsified ego. What the falsified ego is: the falsified ego is a pompousness, is a pompous adjective that attaches it to the self. Let's say when one says that I want to be a prime minister, it is a want, it is a desire, and it is justified. However, if one says I am more than capable enough to be the prime minister of this country, that is a pompous ego. That is a very bad thing to happen, and a bad thing to have as well. That is the pompous, the false ego that one should shed, that you are not entitled to things, you are not, let's say, entitled to positions and places wherever you want, you are not entitled to having things. That is the false ego. Now that doesn't mean that one cannot desire to be the president or the prime minister of a country. That is a good ego to have, to, let's say, desire to, let's say, yes, I want to be this, I want to be that. That is a good ego to have. The false ego puts you in a position where you are already there, and it makes you think that you are entitled to it. It makes you think that you are entitled to it. It makes you think that you have already have that, and everything that comes with it, you should already have this as of this moment. Whereas the real ego, the good ego that we can, let's say, put in this context, is the ego that sheds all of this entitlement, that has nothing to do with the position and with where they are. But yes, to put in words, the desire can be a hindrance, but that desire is a part of the good ego, or at least a way to it. Now, I mean, of course, I understand that most people would have got what this falsified ego is. It is the general definition of ego that we use and throw around nowadays. Now, the real ego that I'm talking about, what is that? What really does that real ego mean? What does that real ego mean? What does that higher ego, that higher self mean? So that is what we'll continue on with. And that higher ego, that real ego that I'm talking about in this video, is something that one should have. Not one, everyone should have. And that ego is become, and that ego is about becoming the higher self. That ego is about becoming the higher self. That ego is about becoming a better self, and that better self comes from within. That doesn't come out of making things up in your mind and being like, I am this, I am that, and that is why I have become such a great person. And that is the falsified ego. But when these things happen, or when you are kind of seeing that you are becoming better at something, you are having something good, or something good has happened with your life, in your life, whatever it may be, one has to understand, one shouldn't be bringing this false and bad ego to it. Keep the natural ego, keep the natural state of things, because ego has driven man from fire to wheel to kingdoms to nations to space. And that is what ego does, that it drives people. But again, that pompous ego where someone claims to be the ruler of all lands, the rulers of all sea, the rulers of all kingdoms, the rulers of all, planets, they will perish. And it is natural for every human to perish, but they will perish in a sense that even though they could have conquer the known world, they will still have they still would have not been able to conquer the unknown. of what which is not. And that is where the real ego comes in. The real ego doesn't have any expectations. The real ego is without any wants and desires. Sure, sometimes to reach that real ego, one will have desires, one will have wants, but those wants and desires are just the path to get to the real ego, the real state. Now when one enters, or when one has that ego, or when one has that state, one has to become one with it. One cannot differentiate between that ego and this state in which you already are. You must be in a process of becoming the ego, or pulling that ego towards you, so that you and the ego become one. That I in the ego, that I which is in the ego, shall be the I with you. That I with the ego shall be the I with you. And that is the process of becoming one with the ego. So it is simple, and as all things have ever been. So it is simple that one must, in order to become the higher ego, the higher self, the ego, the good ego. Again, I'm emphasizing on the good ego that I'm talking about. I'm not saying that one should have pompous desires and needs about everything in the world. That is false. Everyone knows it. I'm talking about the real ego, the real self. About that. And when one has to become that, one should be one with that ego. One shouldn't look at it. One shouldn't be looking at it like a higher self. One shouldn't be looking at it at something very different and very unique. No, it is very plain. It is very simple. And you are in transformation. You are in the process of becoming that. And that ego, when it becomes one with you, when you become one with that ego, that is when the ego recedes. That is when there is no ego. There only becomes you. There is only one I. There is not the I. There are only you. And that is when, let's say, true ego forms, or the true you forms. Because ego, again, is just a word. And as I emphasized before, words are just here to throw away some meanings and contexts. And that is it. So I hope you understood what I was trying to say with this. Again, with these kind of, let's say, topics, and with these kind of topics of discussions, it is kind of unnerving to sit down and write it, because it comes off as very decisive, and that is not how these things are. These things should be able to come as of the moment, and these things should be able to come out of the mind, or else they are not true. That is what I want to emphasize, that when these words come, they should be coming right out of the mouth. They should not be taking a point of thought. I mean, of course, while speaking, of course I'm thinking, but they should come from the top of the mind, because when one is thinking, one will write a right thing. If this sentence is not proper, let's just cancel it, and it is good research, and making a good kind of script about these things are good. But however, to reach the true depthness, and to reach that reality of the words that is already there, one has to just say it without anything. I, prior to making this video, didn't know about the title or the topic of the video. So I have to just speak as it comes. I cannot be hindered with a pen and a paper and a moment of distinction between me and saying these things. So that is why these kind of videos might be weird. It might be weird to some, might not be to others. However, that is what I want to put across, like the message from these videos. The truth that is eternal, that will always be, the words that will be eternal, that will always be, and that is the message that I want to convey through these videos. So yeah, that's it. I'll see you in the next.